Welcome to the Stopping to Think podcast. I'm your host, Will Dole. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy the show, you can rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. The post today is titled Appreciative Disagreement. You really should quit social media. I'm going to start with some appreciative words. In his book, Productivity, Pastor Douglas Wilson sets forth a biblical case for how Christians ought to view technology. His basic argument runs this way. Even though the Bible doesn't have any verses about how to use an iPhone, we are not left up a creek without a biblical paddle to figure this thing out, how to paddle up the stream, as it were, of life in this digital age. Rather, the way we should think through this is to view technology as a form of tool making. And tools are a form of human wealth, and the Bible has lots to say about wealth. In framing the discussion this way, Wilson is able to help Christians think theologically about issues of wealth, tech, and productivity. This kind of biblical reasoning is incredibly useful. I think just as a principle, as believers, one of the key things that as Protestants we believe is that the scriptures are sufficient for everything we need to know to live a life that is pleasing to God. That's what 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 teach us, that the word of God is able to thoroughly equip the man of God for every good work. And specifically there, Paul's talking to Timothy, who is a pastor, and he's telling him, you have everything you need to teach your people how to live godly lives in the world. And that's not less true now, 2,000 years later, even though we do have things like iPhones. So just learning to think theologically is something that we have to do because, we live in an age that has all sorts of scenarios and all sorts of circumstances that the Apostle Paul could not have imagined. And yet, what God gives us in his word is still sufficient. We just have to think theologically. What are the principles at play? How do we apply what the Bible does teach us to that? So I think Wilson's move here to say, okay, what is technology? It's tool making. What are tools? Tools are a form of wealth. And the Bible has all kinds of things to teach us about wealth. I think that's super useful. It's a very helpful way to frame the conversation. It frames tech, to rephrase the principle in my own words. It helps us to see technology as a form of gift wealth. It's a gift from God, a form of wealth, something to be stewarded. And this line of thinking helps to guard us against a couple of tendencies. The first is techno-utopianism. We live in a day when people literally think technology can solve everything. To be fair, maybe they think that it can't yet, but a time is coming when we will solve global warming, life on Mars, and human mortality, all with the help of Elon Musk and his friends. But if the tool-making wisdom needed to advance technology is a gift of God and a form of wealth granted by him, then as Christians we can see from the get-go that all of our advancements will meet with certain limits. As Solomon once asked, who can make straight what God has made crooked? Not you, not me, and not Elon. I mean, he can't even make a pretty truck, right? Anyway, technology can improve our lives, but it won't fix them at a fundamental level. And the second danger of the gift wealth view of technology, the second danger it guards us from, is the danger that I'm more inclined to, which is Luddism, or the demonization of technology as such. It's easy for me to look at the world around, frayed as we are, distracted as we are, anxious as we are, and to conclude that if we smashed all of our iPhones and laptops, the world would be a merrier place indeed. But what Wilson argues is that doing such would be akin to taking a talent and burying it in the soil. See Matthew 25:25. Again, I find all that super helpful. Like, it was a good corrective to me when I read this book when it first came out a couple of years ago, and I just listened to it again recently and reappreciated just how helpful it is to think through technology as a gift from God to be stewarded, not to be hidden or not to be run away from. But as Wilson gets close to wrapping up his book, he turns to the topic of the new media. He says new media, and that's a pretty broad term. I mean, it's understood to include all sorts of things, but really what he's talking specifically about in that chapter is social media. So, well, how should Christians interact with this media landscape, specifically with social media? Pages 105 to 107, Wilson turns to the example of the Apostle Paul. Did Paul want to interact with people in person? Yes, he preferred it. But he didn't allow that preference to stop him from sending letters to people to get that message to them. Well, what should we do then as we adopt or think about adopting new technology? Wilson's reasoning goes, we ought to adapt the advice of the old bank robber Willie Sutton, who said he robbed banks because that's where the money is. Christians should interact with social media by being there as Christians because that's where the people is, if you catch the drift. If I were going to write this as a syllogism, I'd put it this way. Premise A. Now, just a second here. I have never taken a formal course in logic, so if this sounds a little sloppy, feel free to correct me and give me a cleaner way to say this, but here we go. This is my syllogism. Premise A, Christ is Lord over all persons and over all forms of communication between those persons. Premise B, Christians should proclaim Christ's lordship via all mediums of communication currently in use. And premise C, social media is a form of communication technology. And A plus B plus C equals D. In conclusion, the D is that Christians should use social media to proclaim Christ's lordship over the medium and over the users of that medium. Now, I think that logic follows. The logic is not the problem. It is one of the premises that is faulty. Not premise A, Christ is Lord over all persons and over every form of communication. Christians should use the means of communication available to them that they use, the ones that they use, they should use to proclaim Christ's lordship everywhere you go. As you go, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We are to make disciples wherever the Lord has us. But premise C, that social media is simply another form of communication technology, is a faulty premise. Social media isn't what you think. Social media platforms are not merely mediums of communication in the way that letters, books, newspaper articles, or even television were/are. They might function that way as mediums for sending content, but not for its receipt, not for receiving communication. Rather, what you must understand as a user of quote-unquote free social platforms is that you are the product. Thomas Umstattd, in his novel marketing podcast, makes this point all the time. If you're not paying for it, you are the product. So one of the things I appreciate about Substack is that I'm paying for it. Now it's free, quote unquote, to use. Like I can publish here for free, but to receive payment through it, like their funding model is, for those of you who, thank you, subscribe to the paid version of this newsletter, Substack takes a cut of that, and that's their funding model. But if you're using a free social media platform, anything owned by Meta, Threads, Facebook, Instagram, if you're using X/Twitter, any of that stuff, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. Your information, data regarding your preferences, habits, and interests is being bought and sold. And because this is the profit model, the incentive structure for social media platforms is not to facilitate the free flow of information, but to keep you hooked into the system. The danger of social media is not the boogeymen thrown out by the left or right wings of the political aisle. It's not censorship or disinformation. Rather, the danger is in the monopolization of your attention by the trivial. The deluge of triviality will also affect the way you interact with good, true, and beautiful content, which really is there. On page 105 of his book, Wilson Riley observes that you can tweet a proverb a day, and if you did that, you could go on for quite a while without running out of material. That's true enough. But I can guarantee that the truth in that proverb isn't going to have the same impact at the cognitive, and emotional level when situated in the midst of political rants, airbrushed pictures of perfect lives, or maybe worse, TMI pictures of this is perfect enough lives, and banal self-help nonsense. It's not going to have the same impact sitting in the midst of all that as if it would if it were encountered in its intended setting, which is real life. Worse, posting on your social media accounts can also give you a false sense of making a difference or doing your part. I'm getting the Lord's message out here. But reading the Proverbs as a collection of wisdom, or communicating a proverb in an appropriate moment to your straying son, is qualitatively different than posting it or reading it on X. Social media is not simply a matter of one more way to communicate. It is, by and large, a distraction from the real business of interacting and communicating with the real people in your real life. And let me repeat, this is by design. Social media platforms are designed to pull and hold your attention away from the responsibilities of your actual existence. To use an example that may seem silly to some of you, but hits a little too close to home for me, is it more important to engage in an online debate over the hypostatic union, or do we read a picture book to my 4-year-old? Is it more important to post a meme about how God helps us through hard times? Meme's not the right word there. Some kind of pretty picture with verses on it. Or is it more important to sit quietly, privately, and meditate on Psalm 23? In short, I think Wilson is wrong about social media because I think he is naive about how it functions in the real lives of real people, especially young people. In his book, Digital Minimalism, Cal Newport has a helpful principle. We shouldn't evaluate technologies and platforms simply on the basis of what they do. Do they provide some benefit? If we didn't experience some benefit from them, we wouldn't have to worry about it because we just drop what we didn't experience as helpful. The danger in social media is that there are some real benefits and some pseudo benefits, which together are enough to keep us using and rationalizing even in the face of obvious negative consequences. We now have multiple generations of people with screen addictions that are essentially analogous to sitting at the slot machine. Occasionally it will pay out. Constantly it makes me feel like it will. And so here we sit, drinking our free fountain pop and eating our cheap buffet meals, staring into our palms, hoping for the dopamine machine to save us. A better metric for evaluating technological aspects of our lives, and really any part of our lives, is to weigh cost and benefit. Don't ask, does this have any value? Rather ask, does this bring enough value to be worth its cost in time and attention? I can't answer that question for you in particular, but to return to the casino analogy, let me remind you, there's a reason casinos are big, expensive, fancy buildings. That money came from somewhere. There's a reason Meta and X are multi-billion-dollar companies. And it's not because you got that value out of the platform. Productivity is a really good book. I highly recommend it. But when it comes to social media, I simply think Wilson's analysis is too shallow and is therefore unhelpful. This has been another episode of the Stop and to Think podcast. I'm your host, Will Dole. Thank you for listening.